All right, so questions you should be able to answer by the end of this video. Number 1, what organism do food chains and food webs start with? Number 2, the arrow in a food chain or food web always points to what type of organism? Number 3, what is the difference between a food chain and a food web? And number 4, why do primary consumers have so much more energy available to them than tertiary consumers? So let's start with a simple food chain. Remember that a food chain shows one path that energy takes through different feeding relationships in an ecosystem. The arrows point in the direction the energy is flowing, so it always points from producer to consumer or prey to predator. Remember that. It's probably the trickiest part of this. If you are still struggling, think about the arrow pointing to the stomach of the organism, like this. Hopefully that helps. Okay, let's move on. What do you notice about all the food chains on the screen? What do they all start with? Producers, you guessed it. Thank goodness we start with producers because they create all the energy that gets passed up the chain. Next in line are your primary consumers that eat your producers. Most of these primary consumers are herbivores because they only eat producers, also known as plants. Next, you have your secondary consumers that eat the primary consumers. And this is where your predator-prey relationships begin. From there, you have your tertiary consumers that feed on your secondary consumers. Most of your tertiary consumers are strictly carnivores, which means that they only eat meat. But some, like bears, are omnivores, which means they eat both plants and meat. Side note, when my daughter heard me talking about food chains, she wanted to make one and share. So here you go.
An original cake creation. But Miss Dennis, what's the difference between a food chain and a food web?
Well, I am so glad you asked. A food web is several food chains linked together. Food webs are a better representation of real feeding relationships because most animals eat a variety of food. The more choices an organism has, the more biodiversity that ecosystem has. This leads to a more stable environment. So now let's look at how these feeding relationships transfer their energy. Have you ever noticed on an energy pyramid that there are so many more producers than consumers? This is because only a tiny fraction of the energy is transferred to the next organism when it is consumed. In fact, it's only 10%. But notice that it's 10% each time. So the primary consumers only get 10% of the 100% energy produced by the plants. Then the secondary consumers get 10% of that 10%, which is only 1%. From there, the tertiary consumers get 10% of that 1%. So they are only getting 0.1% of the organism's energy they consume. That's a ridiculously small amount of energy. Tertiary consumers have to consume a lot more organisms to get the same amount of energy that a primary consumer gets from just one producer. Because of this great loss of energy as you move up the pyramid, the primary consumers have so much more energy available to them than tertiary consumers. But that is also why you have to have so many more producers to support just a few large predators in an area. Here, check out this short clip of your teacher showing you how much energy gets transferred with a piece of paper. I'm a producer and I make all my own food. That's why I'm called an autotroph.
I'm a primary consumer and I only get 10% of the energy from the producers I eat. I'm being hunted.
I am a secondary consumer, but I only get 10% of what I ate from my primary consumer. I'm getting hunted too.
I'm a tertiary consumer and I also only get 10% of the energy from the consumers I eat. Do you realize how much I have to eat every day just to live?
Lol! I hope you had a good laugh at us and learned a little along the way. That's all for today.